In a quiet Alabama town, the church stood adorned with flickering candles, rows of polished pews filled with expectant faces, and a pastor standing tall before the altar. This day was meant to be joyous, the celebration of holy matrimony. It was supposed to be the pinnacle of his life. Yet, before the echoes of vows could sanctify the moment, blood would soon stain the sacred ground. Because when Pastor James lifted his eyes toward his bride, he uncovered a truth so horrifying that it tore apart his faith and spiraled into murder. This wasn't just another wedding tale, it was a descent into nightmare. What unfolded within those wooden walls stunned not just the congregation but the entire town. A pastor, a bride, and a secret so dangerous it never should have reached the altar. And when it finally surfaced, it unleashed a chain of devastation that haunted everyone present for years to come. Before unraveling the shocking details, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the darkest and most twisted stories we uncover here. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. I love seeing our community of true crime followers connecting from every corner of the world as we piece together these chilling cases. Pastor James Holloway was a man his town leaned on. In that little Alabama community, the church was the heart, and James was its lifeblood. Each Sunday morning, his sermons reverberated through the rafters, carrying messages of faith, redemption, and forgiveness. To his followers, he was more than a pastor, he was a guide, a mentor, and often the rock people clung to in times of loss or despair. But behind the pulpit, James carried wounds of his own. His wife had abandoned him years earlier, leaving him the sole parent of their only child. That child, his son, grew up defiant, distant, straying further and further from his father's world of scripture and song. James prayed endlessly for reconciliation, yearning for the day he might see his son return home. As the years drifted by, James buried his emptiness beneath duty, finding solace not in family but in his parish. And among his devoted congregation, there was one presence who reignited something within him, a spark of warmth, of life. Her name was Angela. She was younger, full of energy, and seemed to carry light wherever she went. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to smile again. The congregation rejoiced. They saw in Angela the blessing of new beginnings for their pastor, a chance at happiness he had been denied for so long. Their relationship was celebrated openly, no one questioned her presence, no one doubted their love. To the church, Angela was a gift from God. But hidden beneath her modest dress and graceful smile, Angela harbored a devastating secret, one that would not only shatter James's world but destroy the very sanctity of the church when it finally emerged. Angela was a puzzle few ever solved. She had appeared almost suddenly in James's life, as though she had stepped out of thin air. Within months, she became inseparable from him, a constant presence both inside the church and in his personal life. To the congregation, she was polite, respectful, always seated in the very front pew with her eyes fixed on James as he preached. Her modest dresses, quiet demeanor, and warm smile only deepened the trust others placed in her. But outside the church walls, Angela was someone else entirely. Her history was fragmented, filled with missing pieces that never quite fit together. She moved often, drifting from one small town to another, leaving behind nothing more than whispers and questions. Old acquaintances remembered her carefully dodging personal questions, always uneasy when family was mentioned, always quick to steer conversations elsewhere. She wore her grace like a shield, masking a heavy past that weighed on her shoulders. James never pushed her for details. To him, Angela was hope personified, a chance to heal the loneliness that had lingered for years. Their romance advanced quickly, perhaps too quickly for some, but James dismissed the murmurs. In his eyes, Angela was an answered prayer, a gift from God delivered to his weary soul. He truly believed that patience and devotion had finally been rewarded. What James didn't realize was that Angela's path to his altar wasn't paved by fate. It had been shaped by choices she made and shadows she thought she'd outrun. And buried in those shadows was a connection so appalling, so unimaginable, that if James ever discovered it, his entire world would collapse. As the wedding day approached, that secret began pressing closer to the surface. Angela carried herself with grace, but the weight of what she hid was suffocating. For James, the days before the ceremony were filled with anticipation, nerves, and hope. For Angela, they were haunted by fear that the truth she carried would rise in the most public, unforgiving of places. The morning of the wedding was filled with buzzing anticipation. Church bells tolled gently across the small Alabama town, summoning friends, neighbors, and parishioners. The scent of fresh flowers filled the air as families hurried into the church, dressed in their Sunday best. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of expectant guests, and the hum of excitement blended with whispered blessings. For many in attendance, this wedding was more than a union of two souls. It was a victory, a sign that their pastor, who had carried them through grief, baptisms, and funerals, was finally stepping into joy himself. At the altar, James stood tall, clothed in a crisp black suit, his Bible resting solemnly nearby. His hands trembled, not from cold feet, but from the magnitude of the moment. Perhaps, at last, after so many years of pain, God had chosen to grant him peace. His eyes scanned the familiar faces in the crowd, though deep within, a whisper of unease tugged at him, faint but persistent. Angela arrived moments later, radiant in her white gown, her veil catching the morning light. Every head turned. Guests leaned forward, murmuring about her beauty, remarking on how blessed James must be. The choir's soft hum wrapped the room in serenity. From the outside, everything looked perfect, too perfect. Yet James noticed it. A flicker in Angela's eyes as she walked toward him. A shadow that passed swiftly behind her smile, gone before he could name it. He brushed it off his wedding day nerves, convincing himself nothing was wrong. But his heart quickened with each step she took closer to the altar. When she finally reached him and their hands touched, silence settled over the congregation. James felt a rush of warmth, believing for a fleeting moment that his prayers had been answered. But buried beneath the stillness was a truth waiting to erupt, a truth that would transform this holy ceremony into a stage for horror. The ceremony began like countless others James had presided over. The choir's gentle harmony faded. The congregation quieted. He lifted his Bible with steady hands, his voice rising and echoing through the chapel as he read verses about love, unity, and the sacred covenant of marriage. Each word carried extra weight, as if he were reminding not only his congregation but himself of the promise he was about to make. Angela stood across from him, her veil trembling faintly with the stir of air in the room. Her smile lingered, but it was fragile, strained. A few guests exchanged glances, whispering about her nerves, but James pressed forward. He spoke the vows with conviction, silencing any doubt among the crowd. For a brief, fragile moment, it felt as though nothing could possibly unravel the day. Then came the exchange of vows. James reached for Angela's hand, his fingers brushing against her skin. And that's when he saw it. A small, distinct birthmark etched on her wrist. His heart froze. That mark wasn't unfamiliar, it was one he had seen before, long ago, on the tiny wrist of a child he once cradled. His own son. Time seemed to fracture. Memories came flooding back in jagged flashes, the hospital, the night his wife walked away, the years of estrangement, the ache of unanswered prayers. His mind reeled. His bride, the woman he believed had brought him salvation, was bound to him by something far darker than love. Blood. Confusion twisted into horror as he clutched her hand tighter. His breathing grew ragged. Across from him, Angela's eyes widened, her lips parting in silent realization. She knew. She knew the truth had surfaced, here, at the very altar she had hoped would conceal it. The congregation remained still, unaware of the inferno erupting inside their pastor. To them, he appeared emotional, perhaps overwhelmed by the gravity of the vows. But inside James, the holy sanctuary was collapsing into chaos. His bride was not just a woman with secrets, she was tied to his past in the most forbidden, destructive way imaginable. James's chest rose and fell in rapid bursts, every breath heavier than the last. His eyes searched hers desperately, clawing for denial, for some sign that this was a mistake. But Angela gave none. Her smile faltered completely. Her lips quivered. And in her eyes was something James had never seen before, fear. His voice wavered as he stumbled over the next line of the vows. Guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another, thinking perhaps their pastor was buckling under the emotional weight of his own wedding. But within James's mind, the room was spinning violently. He thought of his son, of all the nights he had begged God for reunion, and now he wondered if this horror, was the answer. Angela leaned in slightly, her voice trembling as she whispered, "James, please." It was not the plea of a bride in love, it was the desperate cry of someone trying to prevent collapse. But her words only deepened the fracture inside him. The church no longer felt sacred. The altar no longer felt holy. Everything had been desecrated in an instant. The congregation watched in suffocating silence. They expected their pastor to smile, to speak, to bless the moment with joy. Instead, they saw sweat bead along his brow, his grip on Angela's hand tightening until she winced. Something was terribly wrong, though no one yet understood. At that moment, James was no longer a man leading a ceremony. He was a father staring into the abyss of betrayal, teetering between silence and revelation. And with each second, his control began to unravel. The silence inside the church grew unbearable, pressing down on everyone like a weight. James's throat tightened as he tried to push the vows forward, but the words shriveled into dust before they left his tongue. His eyes darted between Angela's face and the birthmark on her wrist, the mark that screamed of blood ties, of betrayal, of a truth too monstrous to contain. Finally, his voice broke through the suffocating quiet. Low at first, then sharper, echoing through the wooden beams of the chapel. "Who are you really?" Gasps rippled through the pews. Guests leaned forward, straining to hear, wondering if they had misunderstood. But James's voice was clear, trembling with fury and heartbreak. This was no longer a wedding. It was an interrogation. Angela's eyes welled with tears, her veil trembling as she whispered back, "James, not here. Please, not like this." Her words cracked with desperation, but they only ignited the storm raging inside him. His hand shook violently as he pulled back from her, pointing now, his face twisted between rage and devastation. The congregation froze. Mothers instinctively held their children closer. Men exchanged wary glances but did not move. The choir sat in silence, their voices swallowed by the chaos unfolding at the altar. This was their pastor, the man they trusted, the one who had shepherded their souls, now breaking before them, his faith stripped bare in front of God and everyone. James's voice rose, unsteady but ferocious, filling every corner of the church. "You dare stand at God's altar and hide this from me?" The words slammed into the congregation like a thunderclap. Guests recoiled, the atmosphere shifting into something dark, unbearable. The air felt electrified, heavy with dread. Angela's tears spilled freely now, her veil sliding slightly as she shook her head, her body trembling. The lie she had carried into this sacred place had been torn open, exposed before the very man she thought she could deceive. And there was no way back. The church seemed to snap like a taut string. James's chest heaved, his eyes wild, and in a single, desperate motion, he seized the heavy Bible from the altar, slamming it onto the surface with a force that rattled the candles. The congregation gasped in unison, some rising from their seats, torn between fleeing and staying rooted in disbelief. Angela staggered backward, her veil falling from her head, her face pale with terror. "James, stop, please," she cried, her voice cracking, echoing through the chamber. But the man standing before her was no longer the calm, revered pastor. He was a father shattered, a man crushed by betrayal, convinced that the altar itself had been desecrated. With trembling hands, James reached inside his coat. When his fingers emerged, they held a gun. Screams erupted instantly. Mothers shielded their children, ducking low in the pews. Men scrambled, unsure whether to run or intervene. Panic rippled through the sanctuary, the sacred space dissolving into chaos. But James's focus never wavered. His hand shook, his voice breaking as he aimed the weapon at Angela's chest. "You are not my blessing," he thundered. His voice cracked, but his fury surged. "You are my curse." Angela stumbled backward, her hands raised, pleading with him through sobs, her words drowned by the thunderous sound of panic. His body trembled, torn between despair and violence, between collapsing under the weight of his grief or ending it with a single act. For a breathless moment, time froze. The congregation held still, their fear filling the air like smoke. The fate of everyone in the room hinged on the trembling finger of a broken man standing at the altar. The church trembled with screams, echoing against the high wooden beams, but James's gaze locked on Angela. His finger quivered on the trigger, his chest rising and falling like a storm-tossed sea. For a heartbeat, it seemed possible, maybe he would lower the gun, maybe the weight of the congregation's terror would anchor him back to reason. But that moment never came. The blast tore through the sanctuary like a thunderclap. The sound was deafening, rattling the stained glass windows and silencing every scream into a single collective gasp. Angela's body jerked violently as the bullet struck her chest. Her bouquet of white lilies scattered across the aisle, petals tumbling like broken promises. She staggered back a step, her lips parting as if to speak, then collapsed onto the altar's cold wooden floor. The crimson spread quickly across her white gown, soaking the lace that had moments before symbolized purity. Gasps turned into sobs, screams turned into chaos as parishioners scrambled for the exits, their footsteps pounding against the hardwood in frantic rhythm. Children cried out, clinging to their mothers. The choir fled from the loft, their hymns forever silenced. The church that once embodied peace had been desecrated with blood. James stood frozen, his arms still extended, the gun trembling in his grip. His breath came in ragged bursts, his eyes locked on the woman lying before him, the woman who had promised him joy, who had resurrected his hope, and who had, in an instant, become the embodiment of betrayal. Tears blurred his vision as he staggered forward, dropping to his knees beside Angela. The gun clattered to the floor, skidding across the aisle. His hands pressed against her wound, desperate, frantic, but useless. The life was draining from her eyes, her breath shallow, her lips quivering in the shadow of death. "Why?" he cried, his voice breaking, the words more a howl than a question. His anguish bled through every syllable, reverberating across the hollow church. But Angela could not answer. Her eyes fluttered, then fixed, her body growing still beneath the stained lace of her gown. The chaos raged on around them, parishioners spilling out into the street, shouting for police, for help, for God himself. Yet inside the church, time seemed to stand still, trapping James in the ruin of his own creation. The man who had guided souls toward salvation had become the very demon he once preached against. And as sirens wailed in the distance, closing in, James knew there would be no redemption for what he had done. Outside, the churchyard erupted in pandemonium. Guests spilled into the street, their screams cutting through the warm Alabama air as bells tolled in eerie contrast to the chaos. Some clutched children to their chests, others sobbed uncontrollably, and a few stood frozen, unable to comprehend the nightmare that had just unfolded inside the very house of God. Sirens wailed louder with each passing second, until red and blue lights danced across the stained glass windows. The police stormed through the doors, weapons drawn, stepping cautiously over the scattered hymnals and overturned pews. What they found at the altar froze even the most hardened among them. Pastor James knelt in silence beside Angela's lifeless body, his once pristine suit now stained with blood. His hands, trembling and slick with crimson, remained pressed against her gown, as though sheer willpower could restore the life he had taken. The gun lay discarded beside him, a mute witness to the violence that had shattered the sanctity of his church. "Pastor James." "Step away from the body," an officer shouted, his voice sharp but edged with disbelief. Few could reconcile the image of the town's spiritual leader with the figure of a killer before them. James did not move. His eyes were glassy, locked on Angela's pale face, his lips muttering fragments of scripture in a broken whisper. It was as if he clung to the last remnants of his calling, reciting words he no longer believed in, words that no longer carried any power. Two officers advanced cautiously, weapons aimed, their boots echoing on the wooden floor. As they drew closer, James finally lifted his head. Tears streaked his face, his voice cracked, but his words carried a haunting weight. "She was my salvation, and my damnation." With that, he lowered his gaze once more, his body collapsing forward across Angela's, as though surrendering not just to the law but to the unbearable truth of his sins. The officers rushed in, pulling him back, pinning his arms as handcuffs clicked into place. The congregation members who lingered at the doorway gasped, their hearts breaking as they saw their pastor dragged from the altar where he had preached forgiveness for decades. Now, that altar stood desecrated, scarred by the act of murder. Outside, the flashing lights painted James's face in alternating red and blue. The townspeople stared, unable to reconcile the man who once baptized their children, officiated their weddings, and prayed over their sick, with the murderer now being loaded into the back of a patrol car. Some wept. Some cursed him. Others simply stood in silence, stunned by the weight of what they had witnessed. As the police car pulled away, James pressed his forehead against the window, his breath fogging the glass. His whispers continued, almost inaudible now, pleas to God, confessions, fragments of sermons he had preached countless times before. But there would be no absolution. The same voice that had guided his congregation now trembled in the darkness of his own undoing. Angela lay inside the church, her blood soaking the altar, a silent testament to love twisted into ruin. And in the days that followed, the town would grapple with questions that had no answers, and a faith that had been shattered in a single, irreversible act. The weeks after the murder were heavy with silence. The small Alabama town, once bound together by faith, was now fractured by grief and disbelief. Newspapers from across the state swarmed, headlines screaming of the pastor who killed his bride at the altar. What had once been a house of worship was now a crime scene, and whispers about Pastor James Holloway echoed far beyond Alabama's borders. The trial drew national attention. Reporters filled the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as James was escorted inside in shackles. Inside the courtroom, the same man who had once stood tall in his pulpit appeared diminished, his shoulders hunched, his face pale and weary. He spoke little, his eyes rarely leaving the floor, as though the weight of the truth was crushing him from the inside out. Prosecutors painted him as a man consumed by jealousy, rage, and twisted pride. They argued that James had betrayed not only his vows but the very faith he preached, turning the altar of God into a stage for bloodshed. They showed the jury photos of Angela's lifeless body, her wedding dress stained red against the polished church floor. But James's defense told a different story. They spoke of a man broken by secrets, a man haunted by abandonment, loneliness, and betrayal. They revealed the shocking truth James believed he had uncovered, that Angela, the woman he planned to marry, was tied by blood to his own past. A connection so forbidden, so devastating, that it had driven him into madness. The jury listened in silence, torn between outrage and pity. Some saw James as a monster who had desecrated the holiest of places. Others saw a broken man, crushed under the unbearable weight of a truth no one could carry. When James finally took the stand, his voice was fragile, trembling with emotion. He spoke of his loneliness after his wife left, of raising a son who had grown distant, and of how Angela seemed to be an answer to his prayers. But when he discovered her secret, he said, it felt as though God himself had betrayed him. The courtroom held its breath as he uttered the words. I thought I was marrying salvation. Instead, I was staring into the face of my greatest sin. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some wept openly. Others turned away, unable to look at the man who had once been their spiritual guide. In the end, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. The judge's gavel fell heavy as James Holloway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His congregation, once devoted, sat shattered, many unable to reconcile the man they knew with the crime he had committed. The church itself never recovered. Attendance dwindled until its doors were finally closed. To this day, locals say the altar still carries a stain, faint but permanent, a reminder of the day faith was replaced by horror. And the town? It was never the same. Parents spoke in hushed tones to their children, warning them that evil does not always come in the form of strangers, it can come from those we trust most. Angela's grave became a quiet place of mourning, while James's name became a cautionary tale, spoken only in whispers. The story of Pastor James Holloway remains etched into Alabama's history, a chilling reminder of how secrets, when hidden too long, can erupt into tragedy. And how the line between faith and betrayal can sometimes be as thin as the flicker of a candle on an altar. The echoes of that gunshot never truly faded. Even years later, the story of Pastor James Holloway lingers like a shadow over Alabama, whispered in pews and remembered in hushed tones whenever someone mentions faith, trust, or betrayal. The church where it all happened stands no longer. Its doors were shut, its congregation scattered, and its walls eventually torn down. But for those who once prayed there, the memory lives on. They remember the pastor who once preached forgiveness, the bride who carried a devastating secret, and the moment joy turned to horror at the altar. Some say James still preaches from behind bars, delivering sermons to fellow inmates, though his words now carry the weight of regret rather than hope. Others claim he rarely speaks at all, sitting alone in his cell, staring at the walls where no scripture can save him. Angela, meanwhile, is remembered not only for the secret she carried but for the life that was cut short before it could begin anew. Her grave has become a place of flowers and tears, where locals whisper prayers for a woman who became the center of a tragedy far bigger than herself. For the town, the lesson remains clear: sometimes the darkest stories don't unfold in shadows or back alleys, they happen in the very places we believe are safest. Evil can wear the face of holiness. And love, when tangled with lies, can destroy more than a heart, it can destroy an entire community. This is not just the story of a wedding gone wrong. It is the haunting reminder that secrets buried too long always find their way to the surface. And when they do, the cost can be unimaginable. So, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and let me know what you think about this case. How could something meant to symbolize love and unity collapse into bloodshed and betrayal? If you want more stories that explore the darkest corners of human nature, the betrayals, the secrets, the tragedies that shake communities, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss the next case we uncover here. This was the story of Pastor James Holloway, the bride who carried a secret too devastating to hide, and the Alabama wedding that ended not in vows, but in murder. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next story.